Venezuela just changed the equation and nobody's talking about what it really means. Let me take you back to July 31, 2024. That's the day Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice, effectively controlled by Nicolas Maduro, announced it was taking over the administration of the Essequibo, a 61,600 square mile territory that makes up nearly two-thirds of neighboring Guyana. On the surface, this looks like just another Latin American border dispute, the kind of thing that pops up in regional headlines before fading into obscurity. But if you've been watching this region as long as I have, decades of tracking the slow-motion collapse of Venezuela, the rise of Guyana as an oil powerhouse, and the quiet but relentless push by China and Russia into America's traditional backyard, you know this isn't just another territorial spat. This is a geopolitical earthquake. And the aftershocks are going to be felt from Washington to Beijing, from Moscow to Brasilia. What the mainstream media is telling you is that this is about oil. And they're not wrong. Guyana's offshore fields, operated by ExxonMobil, are pumping out over 600,000 barrels a day, with projections to hit 1.2 million by 2027. Venezuela, sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, is desperate for a piece of that action. Maduro's government, sanctioned to oblivion and starved of hard currency, has every incentive to grab what it can. The official narrative goes something like: Venezuela has a historical claim to the Essequibo dating back to colonial times, Guyana is illegally exploiting resources in disputed waters, and the International Court of Justice has no business meddling in what's essentially a bilateral issue. Maduro's regime has even held a referendum, widely dismissed as a sham, where 95% of voters supposedly backed annexation. The US has responded with military exercises in Guyana, the UK has sent a warship to the region, and Brazil, caught in the middle, is nervously watching its northern border. It all sounds like a classic case of a failing state lashing out, right? But here's the problem with that: it's not just about oil. And it's not just about Venezuela. What's really happening here is a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, one that Washington is woefully unprepared to counter. This isn't just Maduro's last gasp. It's a calculated move in a much larger game, one where the rules are being rewritten by powers that don't play by America's rules. Let me tell you what's really going on. The official story, and why it doesn't hold up. The story the media is feeding you goes like: Venezuela, a country in economic freefall, is making a desperate bid to reclaim a territory it lost to Guyana in 1899. The Essequibo is rich in oil, gold, and timber, and Guyana's sudden wealth, it's the fastest growing economy in the world, thanks to Exxon's discoveries, has made it a target. Maduro, facing elections in 2024 and a population that's more interested in fleeing the country than voting for him, needs a distraction. So he revives an old claim, holds a referendum, and starts making noises about annexation. The US and its allies respond with shows of force, military drills, warships, statements of support for Guyana's sovereignty. The ICJ rules that Venezuela must not take any action to alter the status quo. Case closed, right? Not even close. First, let's talk about that referendum. The Venezuelan government claims 10.5 million people voted, with 95% supporting annexation. Independent observers, including the Carter Center, called the process a farce. The turnout was likely a fraction of what was claimed, and the questions were so leading that they might as well have asked, do you support your country, or do you hate it? But here's the: even if the referendum was a sham, it doesn't matter. Maduro doesn't need legitimacy. He needs a pret, and he's got one. Second, the oil argument is only half the story. Yes, Guyana's offshore fields are a goldmine, but Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo isn't just about the resources under the seabed. It's about the resources on land: gold, diamonds, and, critically, rare earth minerals. The Essequibo is believed to hold significant deposits of niobium and tantalum, two metals that are essential for everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. China, which has been quietly investing in Venezuela's mining sector for years, is already positioning itself to exploit these resources. In 2023, Beijing signed a $1.2 billion deal with Maduro to develop Venezuela's gold and rare earth sectors. Coincidence? I don't think so. Third, and most importantly, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for influence in Latin America, a region that the US has taken for granted for decades. Venezuela is broke, isolated, and dependent on foreign patrons. And those patrons, Russia and China, are more than happy to step in. Moscow has been propping up Maduro for years, supplying arms, intelligence, and diplomatic cover at the UN. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a client state, lending it over $60 billion since 2007 in exchange for oil and access to its resources. Now, with the Essequibo in play, both countries have a vested interest in seeing Venezuela succeed. Because if Venezuela can redraw the map, it sets a precedent. And that precedent is dangerous. Here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. response to this crisis has been military exercises, sanctions, and sternly worded statements. But none of that addresses the root of the problem. Venezuela isn't acting alone. It's acting as a proxy, a weak but willing one, for powers that see an opportunity to challenge U.S. dominance in its own hemisphere. And the U.S., distracted by wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, is playing right into their hands. The hidden Russia, China, and the new great game. Let's talk about the elephants in the room. Russia and China aren't just bystanders in this crisis. They're active participants, and they're playing a long game. Start with Russia. Moscow has been Maduro's lifeline since the U.S. first imposed sanctions in 2017. Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil giant, has been helping Venezuela evade sanctions by trading its oil on the gray market. Russian military advisors have been spotted in Venezuela, and in 2019, Moscow sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to the country in a show of support. Now, with the Essequibo crisis heating up, Russia is once again stepping in. In December 2023, just days after Venezuela's referendum, Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement supporting Venezuela's right to defend its territorial integrity. That might sound like boilerplate diplomacy, but in the context of the current crisis, it's anything but. Russia is signaling that it's willing to back Venezuela's claims diplomatically, and possibly more. Why? Because Russia sees Venezuela as a foothold in America's backyard. Every crisis that ties up U.S. resources in Latin America is a crisis that doesn't tie up resources in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. And if Venezuela can successfully challenge Guyana's control over the Essequibo, it sets a precedent for other territorial disputes, from Ukraine's claims in the Donbass to China's ambitions in the South China Sea. Moscow wants to keep the U.S. off balance, and Venezuela is a convenient tool for that. Then there's China. Beijing's involvement in Venezuela is even more extensive. China has lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, most of it secured against future oil deliveries. When Venezuela defaulted on its debt, China didn't just walk away, it restructured the loans, extended new credit, and even sent in its own workers to keep Venezuela's oil industry afloat. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a comprehensive strategic partnership, which included a $1.2 billion deal to develop Venezuela's gold and rare earth sectors. And here's the much of that mining activity is taking place in the Orinoco Belt, which borders the Essequibo. China's interest in the Essequibo isn't just about the resources. It's about control. Beijing has been systematically building influence in Latin America for decades, and Venezuela is its crown jewel. If China can help Venezuela secure the Essequibo, it gains access to a treasure trove of critical minerals that are essential for its high-tech industries and military. And if Venezuela succeeds in redrawing its borders, it sends a message to the rest of the China is the future, and the U.S. is a fading power. Now, let me be I'm not saying Russia and China are orchestrating this crisis from behind the U.S. Too little, too late? So how is the U.S. responding to this challenge? Not well. The Biden administration's approach has been a mix of military posturing and half-hearted diplomacy. On the military side, the U.S. has conducted joint exercises with Guyana, sent a Navy destroyer to the region, and even deployed a small contingent of troops to Guyana for training. On the diplomatic side, the U.S. has reaffirmed its support for Guyana's sovereignty, imposed new sanctions on Venezuelan officials, and urged the ICJ to intervene. But none of this addresses the underlying dynamics of the crisis. Here's the U.S. is treating this as a traditional territorial dispute, when it's actually something much more dangerous. This isn't just about the Essequibo. It's about the future of U.S. influence in Latin America. And the U.S. is losing that battle. For decades, the US has taken Latin America for granted. It's treated the region as its backyard, intervening when it suited its interests and ignoring it when it didn't. But while the US was focused on the Middle East and Europe, China and Russia were making inroads. China is now the top trading partner for most of Latin America, and Russia has built strong ties with leftist governments in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. The US still has military dominance in the region, but its economic and diplomatic influence is waning. And that's what makes the Essequibo crisis so dangerous. If Venezuela succeeds in taking the territory, it won't just be a blow to Guyana. It'll be a blow to US credibility. It'll show that the US can't protect its allies, that its red lines are meaningless, and that its influence in the region is fading. And that's a message that other countries, from Bolivia to Honduras to even Brazil, will take note of. Now, I'm not saying the US should invade Venezuela. That would be a disaster. But the US needs to recognize that this crisis isn't just about oil or borders. It's about the future of the Western Hemisphere. And if the US doesn't start taking Latin America seriously, it's going to wake up one day and find that it's lost its backyard to its rivals. The military a powder keg waiting to explode. Let's talk about the military situation, because this is where things get really dangerous. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it once was. Years of corruption, mismanagement, and sanctions have left it a hollow force. Its equipment is outdated, its morale is low, and its leadership is more interested in looting the country than defending it. But that doesn't mean it's harmless. Venezuela still has one of the largest militaries in Latin America, with over 120,000 active duty personnel, hundreds of tanks, and a fleet of Russian-made fighter jets. And if Maduro decides to make a move on the Essequibo, he won't need a full-scale invasion. He just needs to create enough chaos to force Guyana to the negotiating table. Guyana, by contrast, has almost no military to speak of. Its defense force numbers just 3,000 personnel, and its air force consists of a handful of helicopters. It's completely outgunned. But Guyana does have one thing going for the US and its allies. The US has been conducting military exercises with Guyana for years, and in 2023, it signed a defense cooperation agreement with the country. The UK, too, has been increasing its presence in the region, sending a warship to Guyana in December 2023. And Brazil, which shares a border with both countries, has been quietly bolstering its northern defenses. So what happens if Venezuela makes a move? The most likely scenario is a limited incursion, perhaps a seizure of a border town or an offshore oil platform. Guyana would respond by calling for international support, and the US and UK would likely send in troops to stabilize the situation. But here's the once those troops are on the ground, they're not leaving. And that's when things get messy. Venezuela has already shown that it's willing to escalate. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Maduro cut off diplomatic relations and threatened military action. If the US sends troops to Guyana, Maduro will almost certainly respond in kind, perhaps by mobilizing his forces along the border or even launching cyber attacks against Guyana's infrastructure. And if Russia and China get involved, say, by supplying Venezuela with advanced weapons or intelligence, things could spiral out of control very quickly. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of World War III. But I am saying that the risk of miscalculation is high. And in a region where the US has a long history of intervention, any military action, even a limited one, could have unintended consequences. Let me give you an example. In 1962, the US and the Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war over Cuba. The crisis was resolved peacefully, but it was a close call. And the reason it was resolved peacefully was because both sides recognized the stakes. They understood that a misstep could lead to catastrophe. Today, the US and its rivals are playing a similar game in Latin America, but the stakes are just as high. And the problem is, neither side seems to fully grasp the risks. The domestic why this crisis is a gift to Maduro. Let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis, because that's where things get really interesting. Nicolas Maduro is in trouble. His approval rating is in the low 20s, the economy is in shambles, and millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. In 2024, he's facing a presidential election, and for the first time in years, the opposition has a real chance of winning. The US and its allies have been pushing for free and fair elections, and even Maduro's allies in Russia and China have been quietly urging him to allow a competitive vote. So what does Maduro do? He revives the Essequibo dispute. This isn't a coincidence. The Essequibo is a perfect issue for Maduro. It's a nationalist cause that unites Venezuelans across the political spectrum. It's a distraction from the country's economic woes. And it puts the opposition in. If they oppose Maduro's claims, they look like traitors. If they support them, they look like they're endorsing his authoritarianism. And here's the US response is playing right into Maduro's hands. Every time the US sends a warship to the region or imposes new sanctions, it gives Maduro a propaganda victory. He can point to the US and say, "See? They're trying to steal our territory. They're trying to destroy our country. Only I can stand up to them." And in a country where anti-Americanism is deeply ingrained, that message resonates. Now, I'm not saying the US should ignore the crisis. But it needs to be smarter about how it responds. Right now, the US is giving Maduro exactly what a crisis that he can use to rally support and distract from his failures. And that's a dangerous game. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, along with their probabilities. Scenario 1: Diplomatic resolution. In this scenario, the international community, led by the US, Brazil, and the UN, brokers a deal between Venezuela and Guyana. Venezuela agrees to drop its claims in exchange for economic concessions, perhaps a share of Guyana's oil revenues or debt relief. The US lifts some sanctions, and Maduro gets a temporary reprieve. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to back down, and Guyana has no reason to trust him. Still, stranger things have happened. Scenario 2: Frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. Venezuela makes a limited move, perhaps seizing a border town or an offshore oil platform, but stops short of a full-scale invasion. The US and its allies respond with sanctions and military exercises, but no direct intervention. The crisis drags on for years, with periodic flare-ups, but neither side is willing to escalate. This is the scenario that plays into Russia and China's hands, because it keeps the US distracted and Venezuela dependent on their support. Scenario 3: Escalation. In this scenario, Venezuela launches a full-scale invasion of the Essequibo. Guyana calls for international support, and the US and UK send in troops. Venezuela responds by mobilizing its military and calling on its allies for help. Russia and China provide weapons and intelligence, and the crisis spirals into a regional conflict. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the consequences could be catastrophic. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case scenario leaves Venezuela in a stronger position than it deserves, and the worst-case scenario could plunge the region into chaos. But the most likely outcome, the frozen conflict, is also the most dangerous, because it sets a precedent. It shows that the US can be challenged in its own backyard, and that it rewards aggression. And in geopolitics, as in physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If Venezuela gets away with this, what's to stop Nicaragua from making a play for Costa Rica's northern provinces? Or Bolivia from reviving its claims on Chile's coastline? The Monroe Doctrine, for all its flaws, was at least a predictable framework, one that kept regional conflicts contained. Now, with the US distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East, and with China and Russia actively undermining American influence, we're entering an era where the rules of the game are being rewritten in real time. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil. Yes, the Essequibo is rich in hydrocarbons. ExxonMobil's 2015 discovery alone estimated reserves of 11 billion barrels, but the real prize is strategic. Guyana sits at the northern edge of South America, a gateway to the Caribbean and, by extension, the AMA Canal. Control the Essequibo, and you control a choke point that could disrupt global shipping lanes. Venezuela, for all its dysfunction, understands this. Maduro isn't just a desperate dictator, he's a student of history. He knows that in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US nearly went to war over Soviet missiles in Cuba because they threatened American dominance in its own hemisphere. Today, the roles are reversed. Venezuela, backed by Russia and China, is testing how far it can push before the US pushes back. Let me explain why this matters for the military balance in the region. The Venezuelan armed forces are a shadow of what they were in the 1980s, when they were considered one of the most professional in Latin America. Decades of corruption, brain drain, and sanctions have hollowed them out. Their air force relies on aging F-16s and Sukhoi Su-30s, many of which are grounded due to lack of spare parts. Their navy is a joke. Its flagship, the Mariscal Sucre, is a decommissioned Italian frigate that's been out of service for years. But here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela doesn't need a first-rate military to win this fight. Guyana's defense forces are tiny, just 3,000 active personnel, and its air force consists of a handful of Brazilian-made Super Tucano light attack aircraft. The real deterrent is the U.S. Southern Command, which has been conducting joint exercises with Guyana for years, including the recent Tradewinds 2023 drills. If Venezuela invades, the U.S. could deploy F-22s from Florida, naval assets from Puerto Rico, and special forces from Colombia. The question isn't whether the U.S. could crush Venezuela militarily, it's whether it would. And that's where things get messy. The Biden administration has been clear that it will defend Guyana's territorial integrity, but it's also desperate to avoid another foreign entanglement. The last thing the White House wants is a repeat of the 1983 Grenada invasion, where the U.S. toppled a Marxist regime but was condemned by much of the world. Today, the political calculus is even more complicated. The U.S. is already stretched thin, and any military action in Venezuela would be met with howls of imperialism from the global South. Russia and China would seize on it as proof of American aggression, and even traditional U.S. allies like Brazil and Mexico would be reluctant to support a kinetic response. That's why the most likely U.S. strategy is a mix of deterrence and sanctions, cyber operations, and covert support for opposition groups inside Venezuela. But deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to pull the trigger. And right now, Maduro has every reason to doubt that. Here's another angle: most analysts are the role of private military contractors. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó tried to overthrow Maduro, the Wagner Group was reportedly on the ground in Venezuela, training security forces and protecting key infrastructure. Today, with Wagner's future uncertain after Prigozhin's death, it's unclear who's filling that void. But what is clear is that Russia has been deepening its military ties with Venezuela. In 2022, Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela for joint exercises, and in 2023, the two countries signed a new defense cooperation agreement. China, meanwhile, has been quietly extending its presence in the region. The People's Liberation Army has conducted joint drills with Venezuela, and Chinese state-owned commies are involved in everything from port construction to satellite surveillance. If Venezuela invades Guyana, it won't just be a Venezuelan operation, it'll be a proxy war, with Russian and Chinese advisors calling the shots from the shadows. Now, let's talk about the economic weapon. The U.S. has already imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, but those measures have been porous. India and China have been happy to buy Venezuelan crude at a discount, and even European refiners have found ways to circumvent the restrictions. But if Venezuela seizes the Essequibo, the U.S. could go a full embargo on Venezuelan oil, a ban on dollar transactions, and secondary sanctions on any country that does business with Caracas. The problem is that Maduro has already weathered worse. In 2019, the U.S. imposed a total oil embargo, and Venezuela's economy still limped along. The difference this time is that Guyana's oil production is ramping up fast. By 2027, Guyana is expected to be producing 1.2 million barrels per day, more than Venezuela at its peak. If Venezuela controls that output, it could become a major player in the global energy market, undermining U.S. efforts to isolate it. So where does this leave us? The most likely outcome, as I said earlier, is a frozen conflict. Venezuela will make a limited move, perhaps seizing an offshore platform or a border town, and then dig in. The U.S. will respond with sanctions and military exercises, but no direct intervention. Guyana will be left to fend for itself, and the Essequibo will become a festering wound in the region. But here's the thing about frozen: they don't stay frozen forever. Look at Nagorno-Karabakh, or Cyprus, or even the Korean Peninsula. These are conflicts that were supposed to be temporary, but they've lasted for decades. And in each case, the longer they drag on, the harder they are to resolve. The real danger isn't just that Venezuela gets away with this, it's that it sets a precedent for the rest of the world. If a bankrupt, isolated regime like Maduro's can redraw borders with impunity, what's to stop others from trying? The post-World War II order was built on the idea that borders are inviolable. That's why the UN was created, why the International Court of Justice exists. But if that order is breaking down, then we're entering a new era, one where might makes right, and the strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. And that's a world none of us should want to live in. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about oil or territory, it's about the survival of Maduro's regime. And that's where the domestic political dimensions become just as explosive as the geopolitical ones. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's grip on power has always been precarious, but it's never been more fragile than it is right now. The economy is in shambles, GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has made the bolivar worthless, and more than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The opposition, led by figures like Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, has been systematically crushed through arrests, bans, and intimidation. But here's the uncomfortable: none of that has been enough to break the regime's hold. Why? Because Maduro has mastered the art of survival through a combination of repression, patronage, and sheer luck. Take the 2024 election, for example. The opposition managed to unite behind Gonzalez, a relatively unknown diplomat, after Machado was barred from running. The regime responded by disqualifying opposition candidates, jailing activists, and flooding the airwaves with propaganda. On election day, the National Electoral Council, controlled by Maduro's allies, declared him the winner with 51% of the vote, despite exit polls and independent observers suggesting Gonzalez had won by a landslide. The US and the EU cried foul, but Maduro didn't care. He knew the international community was distracted by wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and that Venezuela's oil was too valuable to completely abandon. But here's the: even a stolen election has consequences. The opposition isn't going away. Protests erupted in Caracas and other cities, and while the regime cracked down hard, arresting hundreds and deploying the military, there's a sense of exhaustion among the population. People are tired of empty promises, of blackouts, of watching their children go hungry. And that's where the Essequibo gambit comes in. Maduro knows that nationalism is the last card he has left to play. By stoking tensions over the Essequibo, he's trying to rally the country around a common enemy: Guyana, the US, the imperialists who supposedly want to steal Venezuela's resources. It's a classic authoritarian: create an external threat to distract from internal failures. And it's worked before. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with US backing, Maduro used the crisis to consolidate power, purging the military and cracking down on dissent. The Essequibo is his next play. But there's a problem. The military, which has been Maduro's most reliable ally, is not a monolith. There are factions within the armed forces that are unhappy with the regime's corruption and incompetence. Some officers have defected over the years, and others have been quietly sidelined. The question is whether the Essequibo crisis will unite the military behind Maduro or accelerate its fragmentation. If the US imposes secondary sanctions on Venezuelan oil, it could cut off the military's access to hard currency, which is how many officers supplement their meager salaries. That's a recipe for instability. Now, let's talk about the opposition. Machado and Gonzalez have been careful not to directly challenge Maduro's Essequibo claims, but they've also refused to endorse them. That's a smart move: it keeps them from being seen as traitors, but it also prevents them from being co-opted by the regime. The opposition's strategy is to wait Maduro out, to exploit the cracks in his coalition, and to hope that international pressure eventually forces him to negotiate. But that's a risky bet. Maduro has shown time and again that he's willing to outlast his opponents, no matter the cost. So where does this leave us in terms of scenario projections? I see three possible paths forward, each with its own risks and implications. The first is the frozen conflict scenario, which I've already discussed. Venezuela makes a limited move, seizing a border town or an offshore platform, and then digs in. The US responds with sanctions and military exercises, but no direct intervention. Guyana is left to fend for itself, and the Essequibo becomes a permanent sore spot in the region. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most unstable. Frozen conflicts have a way of thawing at the worst possible moment, and this one could easily escalate if either side miscalculates. The second scenario is a negotiated settlement. This would require Maduro to back down in exchange for sanctions relief and some form of economic lifeline. The problem is that Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He's already weathered the worst of the sanctions, and he knows that any deal with the US would require him to make concessions like allowing free elections that could threaten his hold on power. The only way this happens is if the military forces his hand, and that's a long shot. The third scenario is the most a full-blown crisis. This could happen in a few ways. If Venezuela launches a major military operation in the Essequibo, the US might be forced to respond more aggressively, either through direct military support for Guyana or by imposing a full embargo on Venezuelan oil. That could trigger a collapse in Venezuela's already fragile economy, leading to mass unrest and a potential coup. Alternatively, if the opposition senses weakness, it could launch a new wave of protests, forcing Maduro to either double down on repression or step aside. Either way, the result would be chaos. Here's the thing about all of these: none of them are good for Venezuela. The country is already on the brink, and any of these outcomes could push it over the edge. The best-case scenario is a frozen conflict, but even that is a disaster in the making. The worst-case scenario is a full-blown crisis that destabilizes the entire region. And that's the real tragedy of this situation. Venezuela's people have suffered enough. They've endured hyperinflation, mass emigration, and brutal repression. But instead of focusing on rebuilding their country, they're being dragged into a manufactured crisis that serves no one's interests except Maduro's. The international community has failed them, the opposition is divided, and the military is more interested in protecting its privileges than in saving the country. So what's the way out? I wish I had a clear answer, but I don't. The only thing I know for sure is that the longer this drags on, the worse it will get. And that's a lesson we've seen time and again in conflicts around the world. The longer a crisis festers, the harder it is to resolve. The Essequibo isn't just a territorial dispute, it's a symptom of a much deeper problem. And until that problem is addressed, Venezuela will continue to lurch from one crisis to the next, with its people paying the price. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela or Guyana, it's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America, and the United States is watching it happen with a mix of denial and paralysis. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Essequibo dispute is a test case for how revisionist powers, whether it's Russia, China, or in this case, a weakened but still defiant Venezuela, can exploit legal gray zones and manufactured grievances to redraw the map without firing a shot. And the fact that Maduro has gotten away with this so far tells you everything you need to know about the erosion of US influence in its own hemisphere. Consider the timeline. In 2015, when Guyana first discovered massive offshore oil reserves in the Stabroek Block, now estimated at over 11 billion barrels, Venezuela's response was muted. Why? Because back then, Maduro was still clinging to power through sheer repression, and the last thing he needed was another international headache. But by 2018, as US sanctions tightened and his regime's survival became more precarious, he began testing the waters. The first real escalation came in December 2020, when Venezuela's Navy intercepted a Guyanese-flagged research vessel operating under ExxonMobil's contract. The US Southern Command condemned the move, but that was it. No sanctions, no military posturing, just a strongly worded statement. Fast forward to 2023, and Maduro is holding a referendum on annexing Essequibo, mobilizing troops, and daring the world to stop him. The message is: if you don't enforce red lines, they cease to exist. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent strategy for Venezuela because it's trapped between two bad options. On one hand, there's the Biden administration's half-hearted approach, maintaining sanctions on Maduro's inner circle while quietly allowing Chevron to resume limited oil operations, all in the name of energy security. On the other hand, there's the hawkish a full embargo, military support for Guyana, and maybe even a naval blockade to strangle Venezuela's oil exports. The problem is that neither option works. The first emboldens Maduro by showing that the US won't back up its threats. The second risks turning Venezuela into a failed state on America's doorstep, with all the attendant chaos, mass migration, drug trafficking, and Russian or Chinese military basing that entails. Let's talk about the alternatives, because there are a few, even if none of them are pretty. The first is a negotiated settlement, but that requires two things that don't exist: right, a credible Venezuelan opposition and a US willing to offer Maduro a face-saving off-ramp. The opposition is a mess, divided between Maria Corina Machado, who won the primary but was barred from running, and the more pliable factions that Maduro has co-opted. And the US? After years of maximalist rhetoric about democracy restoration, it's hard to imagine Biden sitting down with Maduro without looking like he's rewarding a dictator. But here's the diplomacy isn't about morality, it's about outcomes. If the goal is to avoid war and stabilize Venezuela, then the US might have to accept a deal where Maduro gets sanctions relief in exchange for a freeze on the Essequibo claim and a path to free elections. The question is whether the political will exists in Washington to sell that to a skeptical Congress and an even more skeptical Venezuelan exile community. The second alternative is containment. The US could double down on its support for Guyana, military training, intelligence sharing, and a permanent naval presence in the region, while making it clear to Maduro that any military move would trigger a devastating response. This is the approach the US took with Cuba after the missile no regime change, but no tolerance for adventurism either. The problem is that containment requires patience, and the US has a habit of losing interest in Latin America the moment the headlines move on. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? It was supposed to keep foreign powers out of the hemisphere, but these days, Russia has a military base in Nicaragua, China is building ports in AMA, and Iran is flying drones to Venezuela. Containment only works if you're willing to enforce it, and right now, the US isn't. The third alternative is the most: letting Venezuela collapse. Some in Washington might argue that Maduro's regime is a house of cards, and that a little push, say, a full oil embargo or a coup attempt, would bring it down. But history suggests otherwise. Look at 60 years of sanctions, and the Castros outlasted 11 US presidents. Or look at decades of pressure, and the regime is still standing. Venezuela's economy is already in shambles, but Maduro has proven adept at surviving by playing external powers Russia, China, Iran off each other. A collapse wouldn't lead to democracy, it would lead to chaos, and in chaos, the most ruthless actors thrive. That's how you get warlords, not elections. So where does that leave us? With a grand strategy that doesn't exist, in a region where the US is increasingly seen as a paper tiger. The real tragedy is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for influence in Latin America, and right now, the US is losing. China has become the top trading partner for most of South America. Russia is selling arms and spreading disinformation. And Iran is using Venezuela as a hub for its proxy networks. The Essequibo dispute is just the latest symptom of a larger: the US has taken its backyard for granted, and now it's paying the price. Let me leave you with this thought. In 1904, Theodore Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the US would intervene in Latin America to prevent chronic wrongdoing by European powers. It was a blunt instrument, but it worked because the US was willing to back up its words with action. Today, the US still talks about democracy and human rights, but when push comes to shove, it's all talk. Maduro knows it. The Russians know it. The Chinese know it. And that's why they're all testing the limits. The question is whether the US will wake up before it's too late. Because if Venezuela gets away with annexing Essequibo, it won't be the last time a revisionist power tries to redraw the map in this hemisphere. And next time, the stakes could be even higher.